Hi there everybody, this is Poober here again. We are back in my 0.16 beautiful railroad Megabase. With the newest 0.17 patch supposedly releasing soon, I decided that in this video I will be going over tips and tricks to help you design and prepare for your own organized Megabases. Since we are talking about Megabase planning today, I'll be using my most recent 0.16 Megabase as an example, because I designed it with a goal in mind of 5,000 science per minute, and it is highly organized. In reality, the space still has many flaws, and it can only do between 3,000 to 4,000 science when everything is fully turned on. Nevertheless, I spent over 600 hours playing on this map, but that doesn't include the probably 100 or so hours I spent planning, designing, and testing elements of the space, which is why the most important step in the Megabase design process is the planning stage. Now, before you actually even get into playing the game, it would be helpful for you to modify your map features if you already happen to have a specific goal in mind. If not, that won't make or break your planning process at this point. But after clicking New Game, you can modify a lot of your map features, including the type of playstyle, which is over here to the left. You can click from default and even modify that, or you can click on different types of playstyle over here. I did Real World in my 0.16 series, but you can also modify the resource or terrain settings, and then the most helpful feature I found though was actually the Generate Preview button, which is just down here. And I probably did this about 100 times or more for my 0.16 map, and that way I could make sure that I got exactly the type of environment and resource richness and locations that I was hoping for. In addition to that, I actually also clicked play and then still walked around past the bounds of the map preview to make sure I was fully settled on this map. If you don't happen to have a plan at this point, don't worry yet. This is actually where I started in episode 1, over 1 year ago. It's crazy knowing that the current state of my base started from this little spot over here in this general area. I actually played the first several hours into this map not knowing what I wanted the base to look like or what goal I had in mind, which is absolutely okay. When I started on this map, the only thing I did know was that I wanted to challenge myself to make an aesthetically pleasing base that was larger than my previous playthrough. But when it came time to actually envision what that base would look like, the first part of the planning phase was to come up with a goal that I did have in mind first. For instance, are you looking to do 1 science pack per second, or 1,000 science per minute, 10,000 science per minute? Or maybe you don't care about how much science you're producing, but want to do something like designing the most compact version of a type of factory, or designing a factory that is outside of the meta. Either way, the earlier you know your goal, the easier it'll be to start planning for that goal. No matter what your goal is, don't be afraid to play the early or even mid-game with the mindset that everything is temporary. I have said that so many times, it's practically my motto. Everything in Factorio can be ripped up and replaced or moved over if needed, especially when spots are available. This is about 7.5 hours of gameplay on this map at this point, probably about episode 6-ish or so. And obviously, as you can tell, my goal of maintaining aesthetics didn't really apply to the starter base. As you can see by this bit of spaghetti that is going on that's not very ratio friendly. But one thing I did try to keep in mind though was keeping my starter base away from where I was hoping to build my actual base in the future. One thing I did notice when I did the map generation preview was that there was a large flat area to the west of the starting area, which is why I was okay building here to get started knowing I could begin building my more advanced base without having to rip this stuff up first. At the point when you have outgrown your starter base is ideally the latest when you should have a goal in mind, although again, it won't be a make or break point if you don't have a goal yet. It'll just be a little bit more complicated to rip things up or fight off the growing biters the bigger and further into the game you get. It was actually right about episode 8, which is about 9 hours into this map, that I had finalized the first iteration of my future base design, although I had been thinking about it and brainstorming since episode 1. The actual design process was pretty complicated, but that's also because I was really focused on aesthetics, whereas I'm betting most of you will be focused on efficiency or scale type of goals. I started my design process by actually watching other YouTubers and looking for inspiration. The FACTORIO subreddit is a good place to start if you are familiar with that place. But once I did start getting a few ideas, I started the first actual bit of design process on paper just drawing shapes, drawing my main base location and essential factories like my armory, the Make Everything factory, and other essential factories that every small factory would need that still wants to be able to launch a rocket. After drawing it on paper, I did convert it to a more detailed version of that drawing in a free desktop paint program, although that is a little bit overkill, but for those of you guys who know me, you are probably not surprised. But that allowed me to see it a little bit more to scale if possible, and then from there, I started the in-game design process. One thing to keep in mind when you're actually designing the base is just how big you want it, and whether you want it to be an open-ended concept where you can just kind of continually add on and extend the factories if needed, or do you want it something closed like how I typically design my bases where you only have so much room to fit the type of factory that you want. You'll also want to think about how many lanes worth of belts you're going to be using, if you're going to be using a belt-based or bus type of design, or whether you're going to be using more of bots in your factories. But don't worry, you don't have to have these kind of concrete decisions made quite yet. Although, of course, the more details that you do have finalized, the easier you'll be able to plan it once you actually start converting it to the in-game designing process. When it comes to recommendations on how to design the base, that is completely up to you at this point and the type of game style that you like. There are, of course, so many helpful people on the Factorio forums, subreddit, factorioprints.com, and of course many knowledgeable YouTubers you can learn from that have different ways of playing the game. Once you have some ideas for your base design, the next step is implementing those ideas in-game. There are a couple of ways of doing this. The first one is to continue playing on your map until you get the desired tech to start placing down ghosted versions of blueprints or ghosted entities, or you can actually build up for the base itself. The disadvantage to that strategy is you may have to wait to build up your tech before you know if your design is viable or not. The second way of going about this is my approach, which was to use creative mode, which is the map we're actually in now. As you can tell, there are a lot of disorganized factories all throughout here. You can see the octagon shape, which I started to lay out here, and this gave me a way of actually beginning to lay out where the factories would fit within themselves, as well as designing some of the factories in the base as well, like you can see here. So each of these factories is a different iteration of one of my designs and a way of testing them and designing them. Creative Mode is a mod you can download that gives you the advantage of having all the items in the game that can be powered and tested without having to wait to build those items or waste resources. I did use Creative Mode to start planning out my rail system that was ultimately going to create the main shape of my base, and that's also coincidentally how I learned I would need to plan a rail grid system that was 8 sides instead of 6 sides, as I had planned in my drawing. I'd also recommend that when you start the design phase that you overestimate the space that you'll need, especially if you do a grid layout. And you should also be thinking about how many lanes of rail tracks you'll need, whether it'll be left-hand versus right-hand drive. But if you don't know your endgame goal or production rate you're aiming for at this point, it may make the game significantly harder after this point if you don't plan for that. That is a mistake I made in my 0.16 design because I only used 2 lanes for each direction instead of 4, which would have helped with my train and resource throughput, but again, I was aiming for a goal of 5,000 signs per minute, so not every base will need 4 lanes going in each direction, for instance. If you still don't know your endgame goal at this point though, design your base in a way that allows you to continue to expand easily and in an organized fashion if needed. Additionally, don't forget to think about what size trains you're going to be using. For instance, are they going to be single-headed where they have to pull through each time, or will you have locomotives at the back that can help the train reverse? You also need to keep in mind how you're going to supply your trains with fuel. Do you bring the fuel to each station, or is there a common place each train will travel to? You'll also need to think about your smelting setups. Are you going to be smelting on-site at each of the ore locations, for instance? Or will you have ore trains travel to your main base that may end up increasing the amount of train traffic you have? Don't forget to think about how much power you are using, and don't make the same mistake I did by worrying about it too late and ending up with brownouts and getting caught in a loop of too little electricity. Either way, at this stage, you're going to be having many things to consider and plan. Next step is organization. Hopefully you've considered this in the planning and or design process, but here are a few considerations. If your base is excessively large, like mine is for instance, having like things together will make the base easier to navigate and allow you to remember where everything is. For instance, I put all of my smelting factories generally close together, so I have smelting here, here, and here for my iron and copper. Steel takes up this one and this one. And then I have my circuits in the upper section over here, and then my sciences all take kind of an outer octagon in this section, and this section. Basically, I tried to organize like things together that made logistical sense to me. The downside is if you plan too many things close together, you may end up with excess train traffic clogging up the junctions or the tracks like I did. Now on to testing. This phase would be for those of you who do have a specific production rate goal in mind. One of the helpful tools at this point is using a Factorio calculator. The one I liked was the Kirk-McDonald calculator, where I input my desired goal, in this case 5,000 of each science, and it then tells you specifics like how many of each assembler you'll need, how many lanes worth of belt, the number of beacons and modules, the firing rate of ore, etc. This tool is obviously useful during the design process as well, but this tool will also be useful when you're ultimately testing the factory designs, so you can compare the production or consumption rates you're getting when testing in-game versus the number you should be getting according to the calculator. When deciding my bigger factories, I use this tool to give me an idea of where to start, then made sure to test the production rates in my creative world until I finally achieved my desired rate. With all that said, you might be asking that if I had planned all this out, then why does my base look so much different than my original vision? To answer that, I didn't decide to aim for a goal of 5,000 signs per minute until about the start of my late game, so I unfortunately couldn't plan for that goal as well as I could have if I had planned it from the very beginning, because at that point I definitely didn't want to be breaking up my already pre-existing rail network and pretty much starting from scratch. But thankfully, because I was able to still follow the principle of using a large grid system that could be easily expanded, I was still able to expand my base from the starter octagon to what it ended up being today, which I'm still really proud of. Hopefully these tips have been helpful and give you a bit to think about when planning out your next base. But if there are any additional questions you might have, please feel free to ask me in the comments section down below, or feel free to start the 0.16 playlist from the very beginning if you haven't seen it already, but that way you can see how I built this base in greater detail. For now though, we're going to go ahead and end it here, but I will be back for a new series when the newest 0.17 patch drops, so I hope to see you then.